All right, well, let's open our Bibles up to Galatians 5 this morning. Galatians chapter 5. And continuing to look at some of the thoughts, concepts, ideas, words, the things that Paul meant when he wrote this letter to the church at Galatia. And we've looked at the significance of Torah, what that meant, what it represented. We've also talked about the importance of the whole concept of being free, and we're going to talk more about that today. We've looked at faith and faithfulness and how Paul uses that terminology and really focuses on the faithfulness of Christ in our behalf and what he did for us. And today I want to look at a couple of aspects of things that he talks about, because again, he uses these same phrases in several of his letters dealing with this controversy that had arisen in Galatia that was starting to pop up in different places. That being, what do we mean when we talk about the curse of the law? And then Paul uses the term under the law. What does he mean by being under the law? And freedom. When Paul talks about being free, what is he really saying? What kind of freedom is Paul talking about? A lot of people have misconstrued it. A lot of people were misconstruing it in his day. And this is one of the things, even in the letter to the church in Rome, where he is accused of basically saying, look, God has done everything. He has forgiven us. Christ did it all. We are free by grace. He has justified us. We stand perfectly righteous before God. And people were saying, and Paul is saying, now you can just go out and live however you want because you're forgiven and you're in. You can do anything you want to now. And Paul is again rejecting that concept because that's not what he means by freedom. And it's not so much freedom from some things, though that is a part of it, but what are we free for now? What are we free to do now? Whereas prior to us coming to the Messiah, we weren't and did not have that kind of freedom. And so in this portion of the letter, Paul's shifting gears here, and he starts to talk about this freedom. And in chapter 5 of verse 1, in verse 1, he says, stand fast or firm, therefore, in the liberty or the freedom by which Messiah has made us free. And don't be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. Behold, I, Paul, tell you that if you receive circumcision, Messiah will profit you nothing. There's the crux of the matter. He is saying, look, if you go through and do what these people are trying to get you to do, Jesus will mean nothing to you. He's not going to, you've rejected what he's done for you, and you're depending upon obedience to a set, particularly of man-made commands to make you right with God, plus Jesus, that he's not enough. You're rejecting that. And then he's going to shift gears in a few more verses and say, look, you are leaving the highway of grace and you're putting yourself down on a law highway that is only going to lead to ruin for you. And this is not what God's intention was when he sent the Messiah. And when Paul talks about don't be entangled again with a yoke of bondage, he is not again, and Paul will say this many times in several of his letters, he is not saying that the Torah is bondage. He's not saying that the Torah is bad. He's not saying that it is something that is not good for us in our spiritual walk. He's not saying that. He's saying how you use it is what's wrong. And it ends up being condemnatory. And it ends up being a yoke to you, especially with all the legalistic commandments that have been added to it that you would be trying to keep and uphold, which God never intended for you to do in the first place. So what does Paul, first of all, mean with this whole concept and idea of a curse? Because this is significant to him when he's writing to them. Back in chapter 3 of Galatians here, he talks to them about this concept of being under a curse. And in verse 10, he says, for as many as are of the works of the Torah are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue in how many things does Paul say here? All things. All things that are written in the scroll of the Torah to do them. Now that no man is justified by the Torah before God is evident, because the just or the righteous will live by faith. And then he goes down and he continues to talk about this concept. He says, but the Torah is not of faith. Rather, the man who does them will live by them. Messiah redeemed us from the curse of the law, the curse of the Torah, by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, so that the blessing of Abraham might come on the Gentiles through Messiah Jesus, Messiah Yeshua, so that we might receive the promise of the Holy Spirit through or by means of faith. Now, the blessing of Abraham that Paul's talking about here is a right standing before God. It is righteousness, and it's received by faith, not by doing the deeds of the law. Paul talks in several statements here about curses. Cursed are those who hangs on a tree. Cursed is everyone who doesn't keep or obey everything that is written in the law. And again, he's going back to the Torah, and he's pulling concepts and he's pulling ideas that were written about already there, explaining this very concept. In Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23, Moses writes, if a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day, for he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. Paul's quoting here about that person who is condemned hanging on a tree. He quotes it here in the book of Galatians and applies it to Jesus. That Jesus became a curse, he says, for us. Jesus didn't deserve whatever this curse is. He didn't deserve it, but he substituted himself for us and took the curse that was on us. He took it on himself. He suffered it himself by hanging on the tree. And Paul talks about, he says, cursed is everyone who does not, in Deuteronomy 27:26, confirm or abide by all things that are written in the law. Everyone who, if you don't keep the whole law and you've sinned at one point, you're guilty of sinning against the whole thing, he says. And he quotes there again, Deuteronomy 27:26. We all humanity, all the Jews, they're included under this umbrella, deserve the curse. And he says in Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, cursed is everyone who hangs on the tree. Jesus didn't deserve the curse, but he became the curse for us. And so we ask the question, what is this whole concept of the curse of the law? Now, David Stern, who is a Messianic Jew, when he wrote a commentary on the book of Romans, and he wrote several books trying to get into the depths of what Paul was explaining, he says this. He says, the curse of the law is not the curse of having to live within the framework of the law, for the law itself is good. God gave the law to his people, and it was a beautiful thing, as we talked about, how to love one another, how to treat one another, how to live in harmony with God and with each other. There's nothing bad or wrong about that. Gave them a sacrificial system for grace and mercy and forgiveness, all the things that they needed to have a flourishing nation, a nation that would be happy, whole, and healthy. So he says he's not saying that the curse is living within the framework of the law, for the law itself is good, but rather it is the curse for disobeying it, for not keeping it and breaking it. Paul points out that the curse falls on those individuals who try to obey the law through efforts of legalism. This idea becomes clear when we realize that legalism is already disobedience, since the law requires genuine obedience to come as an act of faith. Habakkuk 2:4, the just will live by faith. You will follow God by faith. The evidence of that faith, it will be fruit in your life. It will be there. It will be the obedience and the good works that Paul talks about in Ephesians 2:9 and 10, where he talks about we were created by God for good works. But it's after the fact of us having been saved by grace through faith. And now we produce and do these things out of a place of obedience and love for God, not trying to earn anything from Him, but that's our desire, and we are free now to obey Him from the heart. The curse of the law, and was demonstrated by what Jesus did when He hung on the cross, basically it's very simple. You can put it in two words. Curse of the law, obviously, was death. Was death. And this whole concept of having disobeyed God, the consequences of our sin is death. And the reason why death comes is because a person who has not kept the law is now condemned person, condemnation. The curse brings condemnation and death. We all stand condemned. We're all guilty. Christ, who had no sin, became sin for us. He took the consequences of our sin upon Himself, even though He didn't deserve it. He took the curse. He took death, and He took the condemnation that was for me and for you because of our sin of breaking God's law. He took the punishment for that. He suffered the consequences and the curse of the law so that we would not have to experience the curse of the law. We will not any longer now stand condemned before God. We don't have to fear death, as Jesus said, if I am the resurrection and the life, if any man dies, yet he will live. He will live because of me, because I'm the resurrection and the life. He will not die. He may physically die, but he, the person that lives within his body, that the real me, the real you, is never going to die. We're not going to suffer the consequences of the disobedience to God's law through sin. We're not going to stand condemned. And we're not going to be put away and miss the presence of God in the afterlife because of that, because Christ became a curse for you and me. So whenever you see this term, curse, when Paul's using this, the curse of the law, he's not saying the law is bad. He's saying not being able to keep it and disobeying it brings death and condemnation. This is what he goes and spends a lot of the first 3 chapters of Romans, putting everybody under the concept, under the guiltiness of sin. Then he talks in chapter 3 at the end of it to chapter 4 and in chapter 5 about Abraham and his faith and only being made right with God through faith and because of the faithfulness of Jesus, and that Jesus did that for all humanity. He goes into chapter 6 and in chapter 7 talking about the freedom now and the way we are able to obey God. And he goes into chapter 8 because of what Christ has done, because of the work of the cross. He starts out chapter 8 by saying, there is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. We are not under the curse of the law anymore. We are free from that. We are delivered from it. So when Paul uses that term in Galatians, this is what he's talking about, death and condemnation. But what does he also mean when he talks about being under the law? What is he referring to when he talks about being under the law? Galatians 3:23, Paul says, but before faith came, we were kept in custody, and he uses this phrase, under the law. Under the Torah, basically, is what he's saying. We were under the Torah. Before faith came, we were under the Torah. And he says, being shut up to the faith, which was later to be revealed. Then in Galatians 4 and 5. But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the Torah, under the law, that He might redeem those who were under the Torah or under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Galatians 5:18, but if you are led by the Spirit, you are no longer under the Torah or under the law. What does Paul mean? Is Paul saying this is what they're accusing him of? If you're being led by the Spirit, you don't have to obey God's commands anymore. You're being led by the Spirit now. Forget God's commandments. Forget the Torah. Throw it out. And this is what the Judaizers are saying. They were saying Paul is telling people they don't have to obey God's commandments. That's what he's teaching them. They're free by grace now. Is that what Paul is saying? Is that what he is talking about? Now, when Paul starts out using this phrase under the Torah, and he's specifically speaking with the Jews, because remember, did God give the law to all the world, or was it to the Jewish people? Jewish people, right? He entered into a relationship uniquely special with them. So the rest of humanity, they didn't know anything about this. They didn't know anything about the Torah. They didn't know anything about the commandments of God or the law of God. He didn't give it to them. He gave it to the Jewish people, and they were commanded to follow it. They were commanded, this is how you live. And again, as we've talked about the last few weeks, this would be a beautiful way to live. The nations will look at you and see how wise you are. Even Moses, when he was up on the mountain, I was reading this morning in Exodus 33, when he said, God, how will the world know we're different? How will the world know that we have found grace in your eyes unless you go with us, and that we are separated because of that from all the other peoples of the earth, unless they know that you're with us, your presence is with us. So there's a unique relationship God has with them because of the Torah. And he tells them in verse 23 of Galatians 3, before faith came, we were held captive under the Torah, imprisoned until the coming of faith would be revealed. So then the Torah was our guardian until the Messiah came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under the guardian. He said that the Torah, the law, was a tutor for us. It was a guardian provided for us. And again, familiar things that these folks, when they got this letter, understood. What is this whole concept of a guardian? It's a tutor. It is a custodian. It's like a school master. And every single among the Greeks and the Romans, there was always a trustworthy slave that if they had children, especially male children, that slave would be assigned by the father of the boys to watch over them. They would have the duty of supervising their whole life, their morals, their education, everything. It would be their responsibility. That kid could never leave the house without the guardian with them. The guardian was always with them until at some point in time, as they got older, when they reached a certain age, the father would then declare that the son now was free from the tutelage of this guardian. He no longer had to remain under a tutor. Now he was free to go out and live his life, but hopefully had learned enough and had been educated enough to live a certain specific way that would be a great representation of the family. So this would happen all the way until they reach whatever the father considered the child being in a state of manhood. And Paul said this is what the Torah was for the Jewish people. And it becomes this for Gentiles as they find out about it. But primarily the Torah is the schoolmaster. And it's pointing to Jesus. People are living under the law. They're realizing we can't obey this perfectly. We break it all the time, not necessarily with high-handed sin like we're intentionally going out to break it, but we do it. So we have to go make sin offerings. Then once a year, we have one big offering for the whole nation at Yom Kippur with the bulls that are there, and then the goats and the scapegoat that carries our sin away. We've got to have all this because we cannot obey it perfectly, and we don't have life. We can't have salvation through these commandments because our breaking them puts us under the curse. There's condemnation, and with this back and forth thing. And so we've got to find a way. What is this constant cycle of trying to obey but falling and then standing condemned and receiving? What is it all, and receiving forgiveness? What is it all pushing me toward? It's making me realize I can't do these things. I can't, because all the law is doing is saying guilty, 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 guilty. And the law is right every time. The law is never wrong. The law is always right. When the law says you're guilty, you're guilty. And you can't escape that. And the punishment of being guilty is death and condemnation. And the law is going to point that out. But the law, see, can't do anything about the guilt. It can't do anything about it. It can't alleviate it. Can't eradicate it. It can't change the person. It can't give them as we talked about last week, a circumcised heart. It can't do that. All it's there to do is, it's a framework of a way of life that God has given His people, the good, the beautiful, and all those things, but it cannot make them a new creation. It can't do that. And so they stand there and they're saying, okay, what is this guardian doing? The law has taken us by the hand and it's saying, look, I'm taking you to the one who can do that for you. Because everywhere you turn, you're bumping up. Remember when Paul was confronted by Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he said, Paul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads, isn't it? Goads, thorns that are sticking out. And Paul, you ever kicked a thorn with the front of your bare foot and your toes, and the tips of your toes hit it and they go straight in? That's painful. And Jesus is telling, this is what you're doing. You're running around. You're kicking. You know. The law, see, was boom. It's condemning. It's condemning. It's condemning. And Paul knows he can't find life in that thing. He knows that. And he's caught. But the guardian is doing what its job is. It's condemning him. And where can I escape with the weight of the guilt of my sin on my shoulders? Where is there a place of escape? Where, like Pilgrim in John Bunyan's book, Pilgrim's Progress, the big, heavy burden that he's carried on his back, where can he unload that burden of sin at? There's only one place that you can go where that burden will be cut away, and that is to the cross. Where that burden will be cut away and rolled away down the hill into the tomb of the Messiah and buried away forever. Because the law does that. The law says, I'm taking you and I'm showing you your only hope. All the symbols and the laws we talked about a few weeks ago, the feast, the Sabbath, the food laws, the clothing laws, the sacrificial system, the priestly system, every single one of those things are schoolmasters pointing to Messiah. The law can't give you life, Paul said. And you want to say that you want to get circumcised and try to live under that in order to get life? It isn't going to happen. All you're going to do is live in a constant state of condemnation, guilt, shame, failure. You're not going to bring life to you. All it's going to do is condemn you, because that's what it was given for, was to point us to the Messiah. It's one of its purposes, to show us our sinfulness, to point it out to us so that we can look for an escape. We can find the way of salvation that God has provided for us. That's one of the reasons why God gave it. Now, after you've come to Messiah as a Jew, and you want to live, you're still going to be obedient. You're not going to lose your distinctions of being a Jew. You're not going to quit celebrating Sabbath. You're not going to quit celebrating feasts. You're not going to quit doing those things. You just now understand that all those things are a memorial. They are a shadow. They have significance because there's real substance behind the shadow, which is Jesus. But now when you do those things, it's not from a place of trying to get something and earn something before God. It's because you have received from God, and you're celebrating those things, realizing their fulfillment in Messiah, and you're grateful. And it's life to you now, because you're coming from a place of grace now and life. This is not a means by which you're being made more holy or righteous before God. But you are grateful for those things as a Jew. You don't lose your distinctiveness. Whereas the Gentiles over here on the other side, you're not intended to have those Jewish distinctives, because that's what God did not call you in that place. But if you want to fellowship with your brothers and sisters over here and do those things, understanding again, there's no salvation in them for you. Doesn't make you any more holy or righteous before God. You're free to, but you don't have to. And especially, you don't go get circumcised and take the rites of conversion thinking that's what's going to make you right with God, because it's not. It's foolishness, and you're perverting the whole message of the gospel. And so Paul says, look, there was this aspect of being under the law. It served as a guardian, and it does that for Gentiles now as well. When the law is preached, sin is preached, and people are convicted of their sin, there's no way of escape for them. Again, the law, when it's preached properly and shared properly, it condemns all mankind. Wages of sin. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Missed the mark. What's the mark? The Torah is the mark, the perfected standard of God, and everybody's failed there. So we're all standing condemned and under the curse of the law. He wrote to these Gentiles too later on in chapter 4. It's interesting. He says to them in chapter 4, verses 8 through 11, he says, formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves for those that by nature are not gods. Now, however, knowing God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and the worthless elementals which you want to slave for once again? You observe days, months, seasons, years. I'm afraid I may have labored over you in vain. Now, there's two sides of a coin here, because this is for the Gentile part of Galatia that he's talking to here. Because they came out from a pagan way of life. And in that pagan way of life, there was idolatry, and there were festivals, there were days, There were celebrations. There were special months, special years, all of those things. And Paul is saying, look, you have been known now by God. You've come out from all of those things. Why are you even thinking about turning back to these things? Why are you? Because there evidently was a pull in the Gnostic direction there as well in Galatia, along with this whole concept of Judaizing. And some of them were being tempted maybe to pull back into those old ways of life. Basically, this word that he talks about, the word elementals, it's things that are placed side by side. It's like the ABCs. Like for them, it was the main elements of the earth, wind, water, fire, air, those things like that. And so there were some temptation possibly of going back to that. The other side of the coin was that if these Gentiles said, yeah, I want to get circumcised and become a Jew because I got to do that in order to be saved. And so when I do that, I'm taking an oath and a vow, I'm taking the immersion, I'm doing all of those things, and I'm promising to keep the law perfectly. And yes, now I'm going to keep Sabbath perfectly. And now I'm going to keep the feast perfectly. And I'm going to eat kosher perfectly. And I'm going to dress like I'm supposed to. I'm going to do all of these things. And this is Paul, maybe he's saying to them, how are you turning back to these things, days, months, seasons, and years, referring to the Jewish holidays? Not that, again, in and of those in themselves, those things are bad, because they're not. But if you use them improperly, they are bad. And the Jews were saying, you've got to do these things for salvation, period. You've got to keep these rituals. You've got to keep these days, months, feasts, years, all those things. That's the key. You have to. You have to in order to be right with God. And Paul is saying, why are you thinking you're going to turn back to those things that were never intended to give you life and think you're going to get life from them? You're fools. They cannot bring you life. All it's going to do is bring condemnation, the legalistic keeping of the Torah for salvation. When Paul talks about being under the Torah or under the law, here's one thing we have to not forget. Never, when he uses this phrase, under the Torah, does he equate that with obedience to the Torah. It's not the same. It's not what he's saying. He's not using it like that. What Paul is saying, though, is one aspect of it is using the Torah in a legalistic way. And all the extra things that have been added to it by men, you are going to submit yourself to be under that, thinking you're going to find life. Or the other aspect of it had to do, being under the Torah means you're under the condemnation of it, when he refers to this phrase. So you're either doing it, you're under the Torah from the standpoint of a legalistic way, trying to get salvation by earning it in your good deeds and works and obedience to God and trying to earn favor with God. Or you're under the Torah because you're under the death condemnation that the Torah brings with its curse. But never, under no circumstance, does Paul ever say that being under the Torah is the same as obedience to it. He's not saying that. Because if that's what he was saying, guess what? His enemies would be right about what they were accusing him of. Because that's what they were saying. He's saying, throw the law out. You don't need it anymore. Forget it. And that's not what he's saying. He's not saying that being under the Torah means obeying the Torah. It's not what he's saying at all. It has to do with the curse of the Torah and legalistic obedience to the commands that men have made. If you want to submit yourself to be under all of that and the weight of all of that, you're going to have problems. Not only that, you're going to be sinning against God because you're trying to find a way of salvation that is not from the Lord. It's of your own making, by your own hands, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, trying to obey God's law. So, what does Paul mean then by freedom? If that's the case, and he's talking about being free, well, heck, Paul, what do you mean freedom for us as Gentiles? And when he starts out, he tells them, as I read earlier, stand fast, firm. Do not Give this ground up. This is a military term. You've gained the ground now. You're in a position on the high ground. Stand firm. Don't let anybody move you from this spot. You stand fast in this freedom that Christ has made you free with, and don't be entangled again with a yoke of bondage. Now again, this is where we get our messed up thinking from. Paul says, don't be entangled again with a yoke of bondage, and people will interpret that as saying the Torah is bondage. Think about how illogical a statement that is when the Lord God Himself, Jesus, lived in perfect obedience to it. He was not a slave to anything that would have brought Him into bondage. He obeyed it perfectly because it was good, holy, righteous. He obeyed His Father. This is a beautiful life. If anybody could keep the law perfectly, it would be a perfect way to live. It would be a beautiful life, and that's exactly what Jesus did. Paul, even after him being saved, and when he even got to his final trials before he went to Rome, he said, look, brothers, to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, find a flaw. Find something I've done contrary to the teachings of our forefathers and the commandments. I still obey Torah. I still keep Shabbat. I still keep the feast. I still do the things, all of those things. He's still wearing his tzitzit. He's doing all those things because he's still a distinctive Jew. He's not thinking those things have anything to do with saving him. Because to him, this ain't bondage. This is what I'm saying. We make statements, and then when we make that statement, the Torah was bondage. Baloney. God says it was good for His people. It brought freedom. It showed them how to live a really free life, a whole healthy life, a holy life, a godly life. That's not bondage. But if I use it improperly, it does become bondage, doesn't it? If I especially start adding things to it that then take equal precedent and standing with it and say you got to keep all this stuff too, it becomes bondage, doesn't it? It becomes a slavery. And then you're on this treadmill of always trying to earn, always trying to keep up, always trying to do enough, always trying to get more, always trying to hope and pray that you have done enough, that you are worthy of God's grace and blessing and salvation. Then it's bondage. Then you get up dreading, looking at these commandments. Oh my goodness, I can't do all that. Because it brings condemnation, not life. And Paul, when he's talking about freedom, he says, stand fast. Don't be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. It becomes a yoke when you use it wrong. It becomes a binding thing when it's used improperly as a means to try to find salvation or life. But especially the extra commands that have been added to it. One ancient rabbi wrote in about Exodus 32:16, when God engraved the law upon the tablets of stone, he said the tablets are God's handiwork, and the script was God's script engraved, charut, on the tablets. But don't read charut, which is a C-H-A-R-U-T word, engraved, but read cherut, C-H-E-R-U-T, which means freedom. For you can have no freer man than one who engages in the study of the Torah. Look at Psalm 119. David, the whole 170-something verses in that psalm is about how beautiful, how good, how freeing, how liberating God's Torah is to a person. He's not talking about something that's bondage to him. He's talking about how much he loves it. He says, I'd rather have that than silver and gold. It's my meditation day and night. I can't get enough of it. Please open my eyes that I might behold wonderful things out of your Torah. Please, how can a young man cleanse his way? By heeding obeying your commandments, Lord. That's how I live a holy life. David didn't see it as bondage at all, because it's not, unless it's used improperly or twisted to be used improperly. And that's what was happening here in Galatia. It was being twisted and used improperly as a means of salvation. And religion does this all the time, doesn't it? Baptists do it. Pentecostals do it. Catholics do it. Greek Orthodox do it. Lutherans do it. We say it's Jesus plus whatever we deem are the standards that you have to keep to be right with us and God. You do these things and you'll be right with God. Notice the aspect. You do. Or it's kind of quietly sometimes communicated subtly. What you dress, the way you dress, the way you wear your hair, the places you go or don't go, the things you can and can't do. We develop our own little Torahs that we add along to God's standards, to whether people are accepted or loved by God or not if they keep them. Paul spends the whole of chapter 5 and chapter 6, really, of Galatians. He says, look, this is what a life that's free looks like. A life that's free, this is what it looks like. It is a life of walking in the Spirit of God. It is a life of service to other people and not yourself. It is a life whereby you are bearing one another's burdens. It is a life where you're encouraging and helping one another. And these characteristics of love, joy, peace, gentleness, goodness, humility, faithfulness, self-control, these things are evident in your life. This is a beautiful, free life. It's what it looks like. It looks like Jesus. Even as John said in 1 John 2:6, he who says he knows Christ or belongs to Christ ought to walk even as he walked, following his example. You need to look like him as you walk with him, that people will know that you belong to him. He spends at chapter 5 and chapter 6, he says, for in Messiah, Galatians 5:6, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything but faith working through love. Faith, Paul says, is evident as it manifests itself through love. Love for God and love for other people, the two greatest commandments. As Jesus said, faith will work through love. What's that look like? How is it manifested? He says in Galatians 6:15, for neither circumcision is anything or uncircumcision is anything. What matters is a new creation. That inner part of you that we talked about last week becoming brand new, born from above. God's Spirit and your spirit now become one. He's taken up residence inside of you, the new creation. That's what matters, Paul says. And then he goes on in 1 Corinthians 7:19, he tells them circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. What matters is keeping the commandments of God. What? What, Paul? Wait a minute. You just said just will live by faith, Paul. You just talked about trusting God by faith. You just talked about the only thing that matters is a new creation. And Paul says, exactly right. But when you are a new creation, when you have become one with God, and his Spirit has taken up residence within you, now he's written his Torah where? On your heart. And now guess what? You want to obey God. You want to keep his commandments. You want to do what is right before him in your relationships, in your attitudes, in your actions every day. That matters, see, because Paul's saying, look, as a believer, obedience does matter, but it's not for salvation. It is flowing from a place from salvation. Because you have experienced grace. You have become a new creation. Now, you are created in Christ Jesus for good works. Do them. Serve one another. Put other people before yourself. Lay your life down in service to others. Bear each other's burdens. Give to one another. Share with one another. You see a brother or sister in need, don't close your heart off to them. If your heart is closed off to them, John says, how can the love of God even dwell in you? Don't just love with your words, love with your deeds, John says. Because a person that has experienced grace is going to desire and want to obey God and please and honor him. And Paul reiterates this over and over. But he never equates obedience with earning anything from God. It is because God has graced us and changed us and made us a new creation that we want to do that. It's just like I've said before, the old illustration. Caterpillar crawls into a cocoon and becomes a what? Butterfly. When that butterfly comes out, butterflies don't hang out with caterpillars anymore. Butterflies have a different diet now than caterpillars had because they have a whole new nature. They're a new creation. They're not what they were. You and I are new creations. We have a new heart. Now our appetites and our desires are different. Do we always do those things perfectly? No. That's why John says we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus the righteous, who stands up in our behalf if we sin. We're forgiven. Doesn't say then because you are forgiven, just go out and sin. No. You want to obey God. You want to please Him. You want to do the things that are right before Him. Faith working through love. A new creation that produces an individual whose delight is to obey God. Jesus said to His own disciples, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, and you're my friends. If you love me, you'll do that. A person that's running around has no desire to obey God, and no one desire to please Him and do those things, they don't love God. Sorry. I don't care how. That's what John says. It doesn't matter how much those words are coming out of their mouth. The fruit of their life showing something different. They're lying. That's what John says. They're lying. They're not speaking the truth. It produces a changed person, a new heart. We are free. When Paul talks about freedom, what we are free from, we are free now from the curse of the law. Free from it. We don't stand condemned and will never stand condemned again. That's good news. Not guilty and never will be guilty again because I'm in Christ. I am free from the dominion of sin. Romans 6. Sin doesn't rule me anymore. I don't have to yield to it anymore. Now I'm free to say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to say that. I don't have to now. Sin is not my king. We are free from the rule of the accuser, Satan. We don't live in his bondage and we're not in his slavery anymore. He's still an accuser and he will still hurl those accusing thoughts at us to bring us down. But now we are no longer wear the chains of slavery that he had us in before. We no longer bound to him because Christ is liberated from him. We are free to live free from the fear of condemnation too. Wow. Read 1 John. Man, how many times John talks about the goal of the love of God being put in our heart in 1 John. And one of the reasons why God puts His love in us by His Spirit is to remove fear from us. John says there's no fear in love, for perfect love casts out fear. The goal of God putting His love in our heart is to remove our fear, the fear of condemnation, our fear in improper, unhealthy fear of Him, the lies that the devil would tell us about Him, fear, not fearing the judgment. John says we don't have to fear the judgment anymore. All that, we don't have to live in that anymore. It's all gone. And when the love of God fills our heart, we live free from that fear. What are we free to do now? We're free to love God. We're free to love other people the way He does and the way He did. And we are free to obey Him now. Obedience is our delight. It's our joy because of what He's already done. You see, the whole idea of what these Judaizers were coming in telling the Galatians, and religion does the same thing today, whatever religion it might be, it's the constant word, constant command. Do. Do this, do that, do this, do that, so you'll be right with God. And God will love you. And God will accept you. And God will bless you. Because you're doing and doing and doing. You've got to get on that treadmill. That is the false gospel. And the true gospel over all these things is this. D-O-N-E. Done. By one person. For you. Messiah did it for you. It's done. Rest. Relax. Rejoice. Live. Now you're free to live. And live in the freedom that Christ has made you free. And don't get entangled with that old yoke again. Live freely in obedience to Him. Love Him. You're free to now. Love other people. You're free to now. It's not always easy, but you're free to now. To live as God intended you to live when He made you, in union with Him, and a life that looks like Jesus. Well, Lord, thank you for the freedom we have in you. And thank you for delivering us from the condemnation and curse of the law. Thank you for becoming a curse for us. We have no concept. We can't wrap our minds around the reality of what you experienced hanging on that cross, taking the curse of sin upon yourself so that we would never have to. Thank you. There is nothing more, nothing greater that we could do than to spend the rest of our lives saying thank you in loving service to you. In Jesus' name.